In Florida and the Gulf states, fishers fish for tarpon. That's the big prize. That's what they want. They want the big, heavy fish. But if they fight them for too long, some hammerheads come around and they just take them off the hook. And that's not making them happy. That could lead to problems for great hammerhead sharks. So we're going to talk about that on what needs to be done and why this is being studied on this episode of Ocean Talk. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of Ocean Talk. And this is a show where I talk about all things ocean so that you can be more aware of what's happening in the ocean so that you can live for a better ocean by taking action. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about tarpon. Tarpon is a big fish that you find in the southeastern states and the Gulf states. It is a prize for fishers, recreational fishers, to get. They fight them for a long time. They get hooks for them. They get bait for them. They get fishing rods for them. They're not an easy fight. They're a very good fight. And these fishers are finding that in certain areas, great hammerhead sharks are coming and grabbing the tarpon right off of their hooks. And so much so that there was research studied on it because of this problem. And there's some solutions that they found, and there's some reasons why the researchers think that this is actually happening to the tarpon and to hammerheads. So the big question is, are hammerheads taking more tarpon off the hooks of fishers? That's what it really comes down to it. So what they did is they had a postdoc student from University of Massachusetts. They went down to Florida and they decided to run a study. Now this study was done using tags. It was done using acoustic tags. And acoustic tags essentially a study where you set up these receivers in a specific path, right? This was done in a specific harbor. It was a harbor known where these great hammerheads were actually taking the tarpon off of fishermen's hooks. And so what they did is they put up these sensors. There was probably about 6 or 7 sensors, or 6 to 8 sensors, and they put them along the harbor. And what they would do is they would take these tags and they would make an incision inside the tarpon. They would place the tag in there, and they would do that for about 14 hammerhead sharks as well. And what they would do is that every time a fish or a shark swam by the sensors, a ping would go off, and we'd be able to find out what tag went by what sensor. And so we know what individual shark is going by and where they're at all times within this sensor, within this radius of where the sensor can detect. So that's how the study was kind of conducted. And then basically the fishers would go and fish, and the scientists would kind of have a nice lawn chair, and they'd be there with their binoculars, and they would take observations. So they're looking at a variety of different observations. They would look at, how many times tarpon were caught. They were looking at how many times the hammerheads took the tarpon from the fishers. They would look at whether the tide was coming in or the tide was going out. They were looking at how rough the water was or how smooth the water was. Sunshine, they were looking at all these things, maybe even temperature, maybe even salinity at the time. There was a couple of things that they took, but those were the major sort of observations they take. So every time a fisherman would hook something, especially a tarpon, they would take the time that it would take to bring in the fish, and then they would also look at all the other observations that I mentioned. So a lot of observations going on, happened for most of the summer, and they would just kind of go on and they would just look at these observations, and then they crunched the data and they noticed a couple of things. So the big observation that they noticed is the more the angler or the fisher fought the tarpon, so if it was longer than 5 minutes, there was a 15.3% chance that a great hammerhead would come in and just grab the fish and just take off. But if it was less than 5 minutes, the risk was down to almost zero. 15% if it was longer than 5 minutes, and if it was less than 5 minutes, the hammerhead probably didn't come by and take this fish. So the study concluded that if a fisher is taking a long time to take in the fish, the risk increased of the hammerhead coming by and taking the tarpon. So there's a couple of suggestions that they had based on this study. The first is, let's not fight the tarpon that long. Let's try and get equipment that would allow the angler to be able to pick up the fish in less than 5 minutes, therefore reducing the amount of time that the great hammerhead could actually react and get the fish off of the hook. So that was the one thing. So let's get the anglers get better at taking the tarpon, using better equipment, moving faster, and that would be one thing. The other thing is for the anglers to use fish finders, be able to detect whether the tarpon are there and whether other fish that look like hammerheads, maybe if they're in the area, maybe go to a different area so you're less likely to lose your fish off the hook. So there's a couple of things there. They also noticed that if the tide was going out, that's where the hammerheads were great in abundance. So then maybe don't go fishing when the tide is coming out, do it when the tide is coming in. So there are a couple of different things that the anglers could do to make their angling trip a little better and have a better time and be able to grab those tarpon. The other thing is, the big question though really was, why are great hammerheads taking more tarpon? Is this a thing of they're just going after them more because they're a better fish to eat for these great hammerheads? Or is it the fact that they're just more great hammerheads because we've done a better job at conserving them? So about 30 years ago and prior to that, hammerheads were down in numbers. numbers. And so conservation efforts and making them critically endangered by the IUCN have led to more protections for these great hammerheads. So the fact is you weren't allowed to catch them, you weren't allowed to kill them, you weren't allowed to touch them. You had to be able to just kind of leave them. If you did catch them by accident, you had to just cut the line and just let them go. And so that conservation effort has helped that number increase more and more and more, because there's more monitoring, because there's, they were critically endangered. And so there's more effort to be able to say, hey, these great hammerheads are actually increasing in numbers. So the fact that they're increasing in numbers means they're going to look for food. And if they can catch food that's, dangling from a line, they're going to catch food dangling from a line, because it's easier than trying to catch them while they're swimming through the water. They're just kind of, the tarpons are trying to fight the hook. Plus they got a hammerhead on them, and they're going to get bitten. They're going to get chewed up, and the hammerhead's going to probably win most of the time. So the fact that there are more numbers of great hammerheads means that there's going to be more predation on these tarpon. And so the fact that it's just an easy catch makes it easier for the great hammerhead. That's one of the reasons. Here's the danger of it all. The fact that the conservation efforts are working is great, but the fact that anglers see great hammerheads as a potential, whether it's true or not that they're increasing in number of taking the tarpon off, and that rumor gets around to other anglers, that rumor gets around in the angling community in that area, anglers are going to be pissed off. They're not going to be happy the fact that they're thinking that these great hammerheads are coming and taking all their tarpon, even though it's only a small risk that they do, only a 15% risk that they do if they fight the tarpon for more than 5 minutes, right? So the fact is that the rumors and the circulation of those rumors can lead towards killing of great hammerheads, whether it's done legally or illegally. Culling happens. This is not new to the fishing community. Fishers pay a lot of money to go out fishing. They want to be able to catch what they want to catch, and tarpon are a big target in this area, like I mentioned earlier in the show. So the fact that they're not getting it because of another animal, they're not going to be happy with that. Some anglers, not all, some anglers might take matters into their own hands and try and get rid of some of these great hammerheads if they're around their boat or if they're around their catch. To prevent that, more education and more awareness needs to be done, and more engagement with the fishers and anglers need to be done so that they can have a good conversation about it, and they can understand why this is happening. They can understand the real numbers behind it and what the risks actually are, right? Because we've seen this happen before with other fisheries when it comes to any type of seal population along the East Coast, Northeast Coast, whether you're in Canada or whether you're in the US. The seals have been blamed for the fact that the cod are not coming back a lot, right? And even though studies have proven that seals are not really the reason why cod aren't coming back, we just overfish them to the point where they're just not a lot or they're not around. Seals have been blamed for a lot of it. In fact, in Canada, there's a seal hunt because of it. It makes news every year, every time it happens, and people hate it, and they still do it because, one of the reasons, like, they're taking our fish, so why don't we just start culling them back because there are too many of them, right? That's what a lot of fishers will say, a lot of commercial sealers, and a lot of commercial fishers, like seals and sea lions, even on the West Coast, take their fish all the time, so they're trying to get rid of them. They're going to do whatever they can. They'll use non-violent ways at first. They'll try and outsmart the seals or sea lions, and other times they'll use violence or they'll use loud noises in which they're not supposed to be using, and they're going to disturb those seals and sea lions, and they're going to try and get their catch back into the point where they're actually going to kill seals and sea lions. We've seen that happen before illegally, but we've seen it happen. It's very hard to prove if you don't see or you don't have any evidence that a specific person or a specific boat has killed those animals. There's been some precedent in killing animals without people's knowledge and illegally to get more catch. Here's the thing. We don't want anglers to lose out on the catches. We don't want the great hammerheads to go down in numbers, and we want them to be able to eat, and we want there to be plenty of tarpon. We need to make sure that everybody is happy, and there's going to be probably slightly some compromises, but the more we know, just like this study tells us, hey, start using your fish finders to make sure that there are no I keep saying great whites, more great hammerheads in the area. Fish when the tide is coming in and not going out, because that's a greater time when predation happens. There are a number of things that you can do to ensure that everybody is happy. It's just knowing more information, doing more studies, increasing that conversation with the angling community, and making sure that everybody is communicating. It may not be easy. There might be some compromises that people don't want to do, but it's going to have to happen so that everybody is happy. And that's really the show. That's what it really comes down to. Science finds out what's going on, the real numbers behind it, if it's anecdotal or not. Is it a real thing? Are hammerheads trying to get more tarpon off of fishers? And then we find out that no, there's not that much of an increase, but there is a bit of an increase. We find out why there might be an increase, and then we find out what we need to do about it to avoid that predation. So it's great. Everybody's happy. We get more information. Science is cool. Conservation is hard, but it's cool. And when it's done right, it's done effectively. So that's it for today's episode of Ocean Talk. Thank you so much for joining us. If you want to find out more about the ocean, please subscribe, click that notification bell. Also, if you want to find out even more and you want to find out on the run, if you listen to podcasts, you can check out my podcast, How to Protect the Ocean. It's an audio podcast, and a lot of the stuff I deal with here, I deal with there, but in more detail in the audio podcast. So check that out. And of course, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Ocean Talk. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.